Recently, since deciding to switch my focus on YouTube from daily videos to releasing the occasional video that has a bit more meaning and purpose behind it, I've been taking a bit of time off. Making daily videos was very stressful and took an incredible amount of work and effort, which filled my day to the brim and prevented me from enjoying a number of personal hobbies that I've been taking the opportunity to get back into this past week. Mainly, I love following sports. Whether it's following the Packers, Arsenal, Lyon, the Mets, or of course League of Legends and its competitive scene, I've always found sports to be electrifying. Recently, I've been getting wrapped up in Worlds and getting all this PTSD from seeing NA and CLG especially do really well at the start of groups, but then choke right after, giving me flashbacks to Season 1 Worlds where the exact same thing happened. But anyway, as I've been catching up on all these sports and leagues I love to follow, I've been reminded of what I think is maybe one of the more interesting storylines that you'll see in a sport that's rarely touched on, and that is the story of the owner. The owner might be the most important figure in a sports organization in determining a franchise's long-term success, and that's something I was taught at a very young age. Let's rewind the clock back to when I was 3 years old and a little G-Bay decided to become a lifelong fan of the Green Bay Packers. For those of you who hadn't heard me say this in previous videos, that's where my name G-Bay99 comes from. Ever since I was a kid, I've always been a fan of this historic NFL team. This is a team that's based out of a microscopic town, the smallest market in any North American professional sports league, yet despite how small they are, it's home to some of the most passionate fans that you will ever meet and some of the greatest coaches and players to ever play the game of football. There are plenty of things to like about the Packers, but the ownership situation is something I was able to really appreciate once I grew older and more educated about how the league worked. I grew up in Cincinnati, where we have our own football team, the Cincinnati Bengals. The Bengals were formed by a man named Paul Brown. Paul Brown was the first head coach of the Cleveland Browns, a team that's named after him, where towards the end of his career, the Browns had dwindling success and he'd be eventually fired and run out of the city. He migrated to Cincinnati and would start up the Bengals, a new rival to the Browns, as he'd actually find a lot of success with them in their early years. However, as time went on, he'd eventually pass away and ownership of the team would be transferred to his son, Mike Brown, and everyone hates Mike Brown. Under the ownership of Mike Brown, the Bengals have been a terrible football team. He's been criticized multiple times for refusing to cede on-field operations to any sort of general manager. The Bengals haven't won a playoff game since 1990 at the time of me making this recording, which fans blame mostly on him. His actions never seem like he's trying to build a team to win the Super Bowl or even a playoff game. All he seems to really care about is that the team does well enough that he's making money. This can be seen with his actions when he's done things like threatening to move the team to Baltimore if the city of Cincinnati didn't publicly fund a new stadium back in the 90s, which was a big controversy. He's overall considered a terrible owner and is constantly ranked one of the worst in all of football. But the Packers, on the other hand, have an ownership situation unlike any other team. They're owned by the fans. They operate as a public non-profit company, and ownership is distributed around 5 million shares of stock that floats around the United States and a little bit in Canada, bought by fans during designated periods over the years. This stock isn't like traditional common stock. It's not listed on any exchange to prevent a takeover from a wealthy investor like what happened with Manchester United and Malcolm Glazer back in 2005. Packers stock comes with a number of stipulations to prevent people from owning it for the wrong reasons and prevent any individual from gaining too much power. For instance, no one is allowed to own more than 200,000 shares, or roughly 4% of the company. The stock cannot be traded, only given as a gift to immediate family, and can only be sold back to the Packers for the price that it was bought. Shareholders only gain voting rights on the board of directors and can attend an annual shareholders meeting, and the stock will not pay dividends. The price, its value, does not go up and down. It's not meant to make you money. This weird ownership situation is generally considered the reason that an unlikely town has built one of the greatest franchises the sport has ever seen, and it's also considered the reason why the team has stayed in that small town for almost 100 years. The Packers are a unique situation, but comparing them to other owners, you can see some of the benefits from having a team that's jointly owned by a large group of people. Being an owner of a sports team is a very difficult task. You have to set up an environment for staff and players that will breed success while also being smart enough to know what you don't know and leaving many decisions up to the coaches you hire, resisting the urge to micromanage them when things aren't going your way. Getting back to League of Legends and the topic at hand, I'm a firm believer that the story stories that follow the ownership of many sports teams are some of the more interesting ones you can follow, especially in something as young and new as League of Legends and esports. When you see a player win a championship, that's because of the success of the individual's performance. There's no denying that. But when you see a franchise built that remains a top contender for years and years to come, constantly a competitor for one of the top teams in the world, despite whatever roster issues might pop up, whatever climate changes might ensue, that's because of the backbone of the organization supporting the team. A good example of what I'm talking about when I talk about following the owners, their actions, and seeing the differences in management style can be seen in the TSM and CLG rivalry, especially back in Season 2 and the year 2012. This was the first moment in League of Legends history that it was becoming common knowledge that some of the best teams in the world were all out in Korea, since League had finally been released in the region and organizations were very quick to pick it up. During OGN Spring and Summer, OGN invited a number of Western teams to compete in the league, including TSM, CLG, Dignitas, Fnatic, CLG EU, and I believe Moscow 5 as well. Of all these teams, almost all of them win, although certain issues prevented some teams from staying as long as they intended to. Dignitas, for instance, had to leave early when I Will Dominate started having some serious health issues, and I believe the team of Moscow 5, their owner got arrested by the FBI around this time, preventing them from leaving amidst the controversy. But seizing the opportunity was something that a lot of teams really worked hard on doing, since this would allow them to compete with some of the best teams in the world, all become collectively better, and it would also allow them to bootcamp for Worlds right after, which was quickly approaching. But while most teams at least tried to go, TSM decided not to. Some have stated that's because TSM weren't financially able to afford it, but a lot of people suspect they simply didn't want to lose their NA fan base. They wanted to take advantage of streaming opportunities since all the competition would be out bootcamping in Korea. Now, this might have not actually been their intention. Maybe they really just couldn't afford it, but whether that was their intention or not, that's exactly what happened, and that's how a lot of fans see it. They were able to increase their fan base massively, being the only team in NA at the time, or only top team, let's say, but they flopped very hard when Worlds rolled around because they didn't have that international preparation, and went 0-2 very quickly in bracket, putting on only a little bit of a show for their fans. CLG and Hotshot, on the other hand, jumped right at the opportunity and suddenly became obsessed with traveling to Korea over and over to try and become the best team that they possibly could. They knew they would lose fans from being on the other side of the world for months on end and not being able to compete in local tournaments or stream, but they didn't care. They thought traveling to Korea would give them a slightly better shot of beating international teams at Worlds, so that's exactly what they did. It wasn't until more recent years that TSM has seemed more focused on having a strong set of matches at international events rather than just putting on a show like they'd been known to do before. I don't mean to disparage TSM here, by the way. They've built a great organization and a great brand in the past, and they actually have shown that they want to be the #1 team at times. They were the first team to get a gaming house, for instance, and they got it on the East Coast specifically so they could play on both EU and NA and get a little bit of a feel for multiple regions' style of play. But this was one moment in time where it really made CLG fans proud of Hotshot and the organization's decisions. Even though it didn't turn out super well, it was admirable seeing an owner willing to sacrifice the brand that they had, potentially losing a huge number of fans and a lot of money just for the sake of giving their team a slightly better chance of international success. The owner of a team really can be the biggest influence in the direction a franchise takes. A good owner can turn a struggling team around and make them into champions with the right actions, while a bad owner can take a storied team and run them into the ground. Each team in League of Legends has a company, group, or individual behind it that owns the operation, and I'm a firm believer that following these actions can lead to some of the more interesting stories and show the fundamental differences between teams. Whether you're comparing an old rivalry like TSM and CLG, or comparing some of the newer startups like Origin with Xpeke and Gamers2 with Ocelot, where it's a very similar storyline of Gamers2 seeming like it's much more about showing off and building a bit of a brand, where Origin just wants to focus on building a successful team first and foremost. These might not be the intentions of the teams I'm mentioning here. Maybe TSM has always been 100% focused on trying to win internationally, willing to sacrifice anything for it, even back in the 2012 years, and maybe Gamers2 is the same deal, really focusing on trying to build a good team above all else, but it doesn't always come off that way to fans, and it's interesting to try and compare the ownership styles of different teams out there. Lately, we've seen a number of big names getting involved in the business of owning a League of Legends team. Martin Shkreli, who's best known for being the CEO of that pharmaceuticals company that bought a drug and then raised its price by 5,000%, currently owns Team Imagine, an NA challenger team that's trying to break into the LCS. The Immortals, who are a venture capitalist-funded franchise franchise are currently owned by a chairman at Machinima, the co-owner of the Memphis Grizzlies, and none other than the band Linkin Park, and are taking over Team 8's LCS spot in 2016. Or of course, you can just take a look at Monte Cristo, co-owner of Renegades, one of the best casters and analysts in League of Legends history, who set off with an attempt to further the development of teams and their infrastructure in NALCS. In my eyes, the owner of a team is kind of like a father. Sometimes you have a father as a child, as he empowers you and provides you with the knowledge and resources to set off in the world and make something great of yourself. Sometimes your father is terrible. He's never there for you, he's never supportive, and you actively have to work against his lack of support to find success on your own despite him putting you down. Sometimes you have a father that believes that you getting your ass kicked is the best way for you to have any sort of meaningful learning experience and toughen you up. But whatever kind of father a team might have, they'll always have one that has that presence. Whether it's a company, a group, or an individual, they'll always be there, and following how they build their franchises of the future is quite an interesting story, to say the least. Anyway, I hope you guys all enjoyed watching today's video. I will of course see you all next time, but until then, thank you very much for watching, good luck in solo queue, and have a wonderful day.